The Pacific War in 1943 was a deadly dance of intelligence, attrition, and air power. Across the vast, shimmering expanse of ocean, America and Japan waged a brutal campaign unlike anything seen before. Aircraft carriers and submarines had replaced the mighty battleships as arbiters of dominance, and every scrap of land, no matter how remote, had the potential to become a deadly battleground. In this theater of sweeping operations and relentless pressure, April 1943 delivered one of the most daring and calculated military actions of the war, an operation that would begin in silence and end in flames in the steamy jungles of Bougainville. At the heart of it all was a man whose name had become synonymous with Japan's strategic genius, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Educated in the United States, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, and architect of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto was both feared and respected by the Allies. He was no ordinary commander. He understood both the strengths and the weaknesses of his enemy. Though he had voiced private doubts about waging war against America, famously saying he could run wild for 6 months but could not guarantee victory, he carried out his nation's plans with cold efficiency. By early 1943, the tide of the war had begun to shift. Japan had suffered a crushing blow at the Battle of Midway the previous year, losing 4 of its frontline aircraft carriers. American industry was ramping up, and the Solomon Islands campaign was slowly bleeding Japanese strength. Yamamoto, ever the realist, knew morale among his men was sagging. In an effort to boost confidence and encourage frontline troops, he planned a bold inspection tour of Japanese bases around the Solomon Islands. His itinerary was precise, down to the minute, and that would be his undoing. Unknown to the Japanese, the Allies had already cracked their naval codes. The American code-breaking operation, codenamed Magic, had been quietly listening for months. On April 13, 1943, Magic intercepted and decrypted a stunning message. Admiral Yamamoto would be making a flight from Rabaul to Balalai Airfield on Bougainville Island, arriving at exactly 9:45 a.m. on April 18th. He would be flying aboard a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. It was a golden opportunity, perhaps a once-in-a-war chance to kill the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor and decapitate Japanese naval leadership. The message quickly made its way up the chain of command, reaching President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. The decision to act was not made lightly. Assassinating a senior military leader could invite reprisals or accusations of targeting non-combatants, but this was no ordinary general. Yamamoto was on an active inspection, within range of American forces, and his death could deliver a staggering psychological and strategic blow to the enemy. The mission was greenlit. It would be one of the most ambitious long-range interception operations ever attempted, a precisely timed ambush deep in enemy territory with no room for error. To carry out the mission, the U.S. Army Air Forces selected the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group based on Guadalcanal. 16 Lockheed P-38G Lightning fighters would be assigned the task, with 4 designated as the killer flight and the remaining 12 as cover. The P-38 was chosen for its extraordinary range, nearly 1,000 miles, and its twin-engine reliability, a crucial factor given the vast distances and open ocean involved. The plan was razor-thin in its margins. The P-38s would have to fly more than 400 miles over open sea, maintaining radio silence and navigating by dead reckoning. They would have to arrive at exactly the right place at exactly the right time to intercept Yamamoto's flight, which would be flying low and fast. If they arrived too early, they risked detection. Too late, and the quarry would be gone. At dawn on April 18, 1943, the American fighters took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Their flight path had been meticulously calculated, even taking into account the curvature of the Earth to avoid radar detection. The pilots flew at treetop height, skimming just above the waves, maintaining a grueling pace for nearly 2 hours. As the time approached 9:30 a.m., the lead P-38s reached the interception point near Bougainville. The sky was clear, the sea a calm, endless blue. Then, at 9:34 a.m., the Americans spotted two incoming aircraft groups at low altitude, a pair of Betty bombers flanked by 6 Zeros. The timing was perfect. It could only be Yamamoto. Captain Thomas Lanphier, Jr. and Captain Rex Barber peeled off from the formation and dove toward the Japanese bombers. Lanphier later claimed he fired the fatal burst, but post-war analysis and testimony suggest Barber may have struck the decisive blow. Regardless of who landed the kill, the result was clear. Yamamoto's bomber hit multiple times, began to trail smoke, then plunged into the jungle below in a fiery crash. The second bomber was also brought down, though its commander survived. On the ground, a Japanese search team would later find Yamamoto's body still seated upright, hand clutching his katana, a calm expression frozen on his face. He had died instantly, a bullet through the head. Back on Guadalcanal, the P-38s returned in triumph, though not without cost. One pilot was lost after ditching his aircraft. The mission had succeeded beyond all expectations. It was a surgical strike, executed with boldness and precision, and it removed the most formidable strategic mind in the Japanese military. News of Yamamoto's death was kept secret by Japan for over a month, and the effects were profound. His loss left a leadership vacuum that the Japanese Navy never fully recovered from. Morale among Japanese troops sagged, and the Allies, buoyed by the success of the operation, pressed their advantage across the Pacific. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance became a textbook example of how intelligence, technology, and bravery could alter the course of war. It proved that no commander, no matter how revered, was beyond reach, and that in the new world of aerial warfare, even the architects of war could be targeted with precision. The wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber still rests in the jungle of Bougainville, a quiet reminder of the day the Pacific skies turned the course of history. By the beginning of 1943, the Pacific War was entering a new phase. The unrelenting advance of Japanese forces, which had seemed unstoppable in the early months after Pearl Harbor, was beginning to show signs of fatigue. In the Solomon Islands, the United States had fought a brutal and grinding campaign to wrest control of Guadalcanal from the Japanese Empire. That battle had been won, barely, but at great cost. Now, slowly and with great effort, the United States Navy and Army Air Forces were beginning to claw back ground across a sprawling oceanic battlefield where every mile mattered and every decision could tip the balance of the war. Behind the front lines in the shadowy world of intelligence and cryptanalysis, a quieter but no less critical battle was being fought. In a series of anonymous rooms tucked away in Washington, D.C., Pearl Harbor, Australia, and even British Bletchley Park, a sprawling network of Allied codebreakers toiled day and night over enemy ciphers. They worked with little fanfare, armed not with rifles or bombs, but with pencils, typewriters, punch cards, and relentless determination. These men and women were part of an ultra-secret American signals intelligence project known as MAGIC. MAGIC was the code name for the decryption of Japanese military and diplomatic communications, an endeavor that had begun before the war and had grown into one of the Allies' most effective strategic advantages. By early 1943, MAGIC had made significant breakthroughs, particularly in deciphering the Japanese naval code JN-25, a complex and evolving cipher that encrypted orders, logistics, and communications between Japan's warships and command centers. The process of breaking JN-25 required not only linguistic skill, but also mathematical brilliance, ingenuity, and often a bit of luck. Then, in mid-April 1943, one of those moments of luck arrived. At first, it was just another intercepted message, pulled from the air by a Navy listening station in the Pacific and routed back through the intelligence chain. But when the cryptanalysts began decoding the seemingly routine transmission, its significance became shockingly clear. It was not just a generic order or logistics update. It was a travel itinerary. The Japanese Navy was moving someone important, very important. Line by line, the decrypted message revealed its contents: a detailed flight schedule for a senior Japanese military official who was to inspect airfields in the forward areas of the Solomon Islands. The time of departure, the flight path, the escort formation, the aircraft types, everything was laid out in meticulous fashion. The destination, Balal Airfield near Bougainville. The departing point, Rabaul, a major Japanese stronghold on New Britain Island. The timing was exact. Departure was scheduled for the morning of April 18, 1943, with arrival at Balale around 9:45 a.m. And the name of the officer? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The room fell still. There was no Japanese officer more famous, more intelligent, or more strategically vital than Yamamoto. As Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, he was not only a revered leader among his own forces, but also the architect of some of the most consequential actions of the war. It was Yamamoto who had masterminded the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, an operation that had thrust America into global conflict and shattered the illusion of Pacific security. He had overseen naval operations at Coral Sea and Midway. He was the mind behind the Japanese Navy's boldest moves, a man both feared and deeply respected by the American High Command. And now, thanks to a stroke of intelligence brilliance, the United States knew precisely where he would be and when. The idea that such a high-value target would travel with such predictability seemed almost too good to be true. Yet here it was, spelled out in the enemy's own codes. Yamamoto would be flying aboard a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, an aircraft valued for its range but notorious for its vulnerability. He would be accompanied by a handful of Zero fighters, the nimble and deadly aircraft that had caused havoc in the early air battles of the war. His route would take him dangerously close to the reach of American fighters based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. A golden opportunity had materialized out of the ether. But it was more than that. For the Americans, the prospect of eliminating Yamamoto was tantalizing, not only for tactical reasons, but also for the psychological blow it would deliver to the Japanese war effort. Killing the man who had so thoroughly orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack would serve as both vengeance and strategic decapitation. It would demoralize Japanese forces, strip the Navy of its guiding hand, and send a message that nowhere, even the vast Pacific skies, was safe. Still, the idea of targeting a specific individual in such a manner was fraught with legal and ethical implications. Assassination of military leaders had always been a gray area in warfare. But Yamamoto was not a civilian. He was in an active combat zone, flying in a military aircraft, inspecting frontline troops. He was not behind a desk in Tokyo, but rather a combatant moving within striking range of Allied air power. The decision would ultimately reach the highest echelons of the U.S. government, including Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and President. When the decoded Japanese transmission made its way through the chain of Allied command and reached the White House, the reaction was as swift as it was blunt. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, upon being informed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's precise itinerary had been uncovered, reportedly issued a 3-word directive that would launch one of the most extraordinary missions of the Pacific War. Get Yamamoto. It was an order that echoed through the corridors of the Pentagon and landed squarely in the lap of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The assignment was entrusted to the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group, based on Guadalcanal, the same island whose airfield, Henderson Field, had been secured only months earlier through brutal and bloody fighting. These men were no strangers to combat, but what they were about to be asked to do was unlike anything that had ever been attempted. The mission would be dubbed Operation Vengeance, and it would call upon a rare mix of skill, daring, and precision. 16 pilots were chosen for the task, all experienced and all trusted, and they were led by Major John W. Mitchell, a calm but fiercely capable officer with a reputation for disciplined command. The assignment was breathtaking in its audacity. Fly over 400 miles, one way, across open ocean, at low altitude to avoid Japanese radar, and intercept a single flight carrying the most valuable military target in the entire Japanese Empire. To protect the secret of the codebreakers, whose efforts under magic had made the mission possible, the Americans concocted a carefully crafted cover story. Intelligence officers claimed that Australian coast watchers, hidden across the Solomon Islands chain, had observed unusual activity at certain airfields and deduced that a VIP might be paying a visit. In reality, the entire operation was built upon the exact timing and path revealed by decrypted Japanese naval communications. The pilots themselves may not have known how the information was acquired, but they understood its significance. Every man who climbed into his aircraft that morning understood the gravity of the mission. They were being sent to eliminate Admiral Yamamoto, the strategic brain behind the attack on Pearl Harbor and the operational linchpin of Japan's war effort in the Pacific. On the morning of April 18, 1943, preparations began well before dawn. In makeshift hangars and muddy service bays on Guadalcanal, ground crews worked feverishly to prepare the aircraft. The chosen plane for the mission was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine long-range fighter with the speed, firepower, and, crucially, the range to strike deep into enemy territory and return. Even so, to reach Bougainville and back, nearly 1,000 miles round trip, each aircraft had to be modified. External fuel tanks were installed. Unnecessary weight was stripped away. Armaments were checked and rechecked. At 7:25 a.m., the 16 P-38s lifted off the tarmac in a synchronized takeoff. With their powerful twin engines, the Lightnings roared into the humid morning sky of the Solomon Islands, climbing quickly before dipping down to treetop level, hugging the contours of jungle and sea. Radio silence was enforced. There could be no stray transmissions that might alert Japanese listening posts or picket ships. The formation flew in tight, deadly silence, the only sound the rumble of engines and the rush of wind across canopies. The route had been calculated to the minute. Flying a straight line to Bougainville would have been quicker, but also predictable and dangerous. Japanese outposts and radar installations could detect incoming aircraft from hundreds of miles away if they flew at altitude. So the American flight path was carefully plotted to avoid known radar stations and follow the curvature of the islands before angling toward the anticipated intercept point. Every pilot had memorized the timing, the headings, the fuel consumption rates. There would be no turning back, no calling for help. They had one chance to succeed. As the Lightnings neared their destination, the squadron split into two elements just as planned. One section, under Major Mitchell himself, would ascend to provide top cover, protecting the attack group from enemy fighters. The second section, led by Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr. and Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, would carry out the strike against the bombers, one of which carried Yamamoto. With the target formation now visible and the element of surprise on their side, the American P-38 pilots sprang into action. From low altitude, they pulled their throttles open and surged upward like sharks breaking the surface, each man focused on a precise role in the attack. Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr. veered slightly to the left and opened fire on one of the escorting Zeros, raking it with his .50 caliber machine guns. The Japanese fighter peeled away, venting smoke, its pilot yanking it into a desperate climb. But Lanphier didn't stay to finish the kill. He rolled hard and swung toward the lead bomber, the first Mitsubishi G4M Betty, believed to be carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself. At the same time, Lieutenant Rex T. Barber took a separate route, cutting beneath the bomber formation in a sweeping arc. His eyes locked onto the second bomber, trailing slightly behind the lead. As the American lightnings closed the distance, the sky transformed from serenity to chaos in seconds. Tracers tore through the air, brilliant arcs of red and white dancing between the aircraft. The Betty bombers, lightly armored and overloaded with fuel, were death traps once caught in a fighter's sights. Their gunners opened up, their 7.7mm machine guns spitting desperately in all directions. But the defensive fire was scattered and panicked. The P-38s struck from angles that the rear gunners couldn't cover. Lanfear's guns thundered. He claimed to have fired a perfect deflection shot at the lead bomber. In his post-mission report, he stated that his burst had sliced through the bomber's fuselage, igniting its engines. He broke away through the formation, pursued by two Zeros, fighting for altitude and speed. Meanwhile, Barber, calm, focused, and deadly, had maneuvered onto the tail of the second Betty. His P-38 shuddered as he depressed the trigger, sending streams of .50 caliber fire directly into the bomber's tail section. The second bomber began to trail smoke immediately. Barber held his course and fired again, walking his bursts up the fuselage, ripping through the engine cowling, the windows, the wings. The G-4M bucked under the damage, flames licking from its right engine. Inside, the crew was likely already dead or dying. The bomber lost altitude fast, streaming black smoke over the jungle canopy before it banked hard and plunged into the turquoise waters of the Pacific, breaking apart as it hit the waves. The lead bomber, Yamamoto's, suffered a worse fate. With at least one engine aflame and possibly the cockpit shattered, it lost control. Witnesses from the squadron later recalled the moment vividly, the aircraft trailing thick black smoke, then suddenly pitching downwards in a steep dive. It slammed into the Bougainville jungle, the impact muffled but visible even from the air. A moment later, a ball of orange flame rose through the trees, followed by a plume of oily smoke. In an instant, the architect of Pearl Harbor was gone. Neither of the two Betty bombers survived the encounter. Of the 12 men aboard the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto, none made it out alive. In the second bomber, only one crewman survived. He was later picked up by Japanese search teams. The escorting Zeros, caught off guard and initially overwhelmed, managed to rally and chase the American fighters for a time, but the P-38's superior speed allowed the Americans to disengage and begin their long flight home. The American pilots had flown 400 miles into enemy territory, struck a lethal blow, and were now racing 400 miles back. It was not just a mission, it was a calculated assassination, carried out with military precision. Later that same day, Japanese search parties combed the crash site in the jungle, guided by smoke and instinct. The wreckage lay strewn across the forest floor, shattered into pieces, with charred metal and torn foliage marking the violent impact. Inside the remains of the lead bomber, the searchers made a solemn discovery. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was still seated in his crash chair, strapped in by his harness. His white-gloved hands remained clasped tightly around his ceremonial katana, a final act of dignity amid the ruin. He had died instantly, most likely from a .50 caliber round to the head. His cap was still on. The expression on his face was said to be peaceful, frozen in the final moment of a man who had lived by honor and died in command. When the news reached Tokyo, it sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of the Japanese military. Yamamoto had been the master strategist of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a national icon, and the face of Japan's early victories in the war. To admit he had been killed, especially in an ambush, was unthinkable. His death was kept secret from the public for over a month, while the government decided how to frame the loss without damaging morale. When the announcement finally came, Yamamoto was lionized. He was given a grand state funeral, complete with full military honors. The emperor himself reportedly wept. Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to the rank of Marshal Admiral, and his ashes were placed in the prestigious Tama Cemetery in Tokyo. His death was painted not as a loss in battle, but as a noble martyrdom for the empire. In the United States, Operation Vengeance was a classified secret. To reveal the details of the mission would expose the vital magic code-breaking program and compromise all future decryptions. For years, the American public was told only that Yamamoto had been killed in action. The truth, when it finally emerged after the war, captured the imagination of military historians and the public alike. It became a case study in surgical military precision, daring air combat, and strategic assassination. But the success came with controversy. Both Lanphier and Barber filed mission reports claiming responsibility for the kill. Lanphier asserted that he had fired the fatal burst into Yamamoto's bomber. He was awarded the Silver Star, and for decades official records credited him with the victory. But gun camera footage, witness accounts, and post-war analysis painted a different picture. Barber's footage showed clear, sustained fire into the bomber that was seen crashing into the jungle, while Lanphier was last seen evading Japanese fighters after his initial pass. As time passed and scrutiny mounted, the U.S. Air Force eventually revised its records to share the kill credit between Lanphier and Barber. But among historians, Barber has increasingly been recognized as the man who fired the fatal shots. In 1991, Barber was posthumously awarded additional honors, and in the decades since, the consensus has shifted in his favor. Regardless of who fired the final bullet, the mission succeeded in its ultimate aim: to remove Yamamoto from the war. Operation Vengeance was not just a tactical success, it was a psychological blow to Japan's high command. It proved that no one, no matter how revered or protected, was beyond the reach of Allied air power. And for the men who flew those 16 P-38s that morning, the mission would forever stand. As a moment of precision, bravery, and resolve, a turning point not just in the Pacific Campaign, but in the art of modern warfare itself. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was far more than a tactical victory or the successful conclusion of a daring mission. It was a psychological earthquake that reverberated throughout the Japanese military and across the Pacific theater. On the surface, the Americans had eliminated a brilliant naval commander. But beneath that, they had struck at the very heart of Japanese morale. Yamamoto had not just been a commander. He had been a symbol, a towering figure of vision and intellect, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the face of Japan's early wartime successes. Yet paradoxically, Yamamoto was also one of the few men within the Japanese high command who truly understood the might of the enemy he had struck. Having studied in the United States, traveled its heartland, and met its industrialists and generals, Yamamoto had a rare, almost prophetic grasp of American resolve and capability. His famous warning, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," was not mere rhetoric. It was the measured judgment of a man who knew that war with America would be long, brutal, and ultimately unwinnable. His death left a vacuum, not just in leadership but in reason. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, Yamamoto had served as a moderating force, one who urged caution when others cried for total war, who tempered ambition with strategy. Without his influence, more extreme voices gained ground, those less inclined to understand the long-term consequences of their decisions. In the months that followed, the Japanese command became more reactionary, more rigid, and more divorced from the reality of the Allied industrial juggernaut grinding toward them. Yamamoto's death, therefore, was not merely an operational loss. It was the silencing of a voice of wisdom in an increasingly desperate and fanatical hierarchy. Strategically, Operation Vengeance proved something just as important: that warfare had entered a new era, one where intelligence, precision, and speed could outweigh brute force. The mission was not decided by numbers or firepower, but by the interception of a message, decoded in a shadowy building thousands of miles away. It was a triumph of signals intelligence, the quiet war of cryptographers and linguists, working night after night over intercepted enemy messages, often unsure if their breakthroughs would be believed or acted upon in time. The idea that 16 aircraft could fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, ambush the most protected officer in the Imperial Navy, and return safely was unthinkable before April 18, 1943. But it happened. The mission revealed the true potential of long-range fighter operations, showing that with the right aircraft, careful planning, and sheer courage, the Allied forces could strike targets deep within enemy territory. For those at the planning tables in Washington, Pearl Harbor, and Port Moresby, the implications were profound. This was not just about Yamamoto. It was about demonstrating that the Allied war machine had grown agile, coordinated, and deadly in its reach. The legacy of Operation Vengeance did not fade. For those who lived through the war, especially for the aging veterans who still recount the battles and sacrifices of that era, the mission remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in the vast narrative of World War II. It is a story that blends daring, intelligence, technology, and nerve into a single operation. It is the kind of tale that draws the breath of the listener and evokes awe even decades later. It's not just about the mission. It's about what the mission represented. That in the darkest days of war, when the enemy seemed overwhelming and the future uncertain, Allied forces could still strike with precision, with purpose, and with effect. In the jungle canopy of Bougainville, the remnants of Yamamoto's shattered bomber still lie hidden. Nature has long since reclaimed the crash site. Vines coil around twisted aluminum, trees grow through shattered fuselage. The once burning wreck is now a quiet shrine, marked by rust and memory. Pilots have flown overhead and looked down, imagining that fateful moment when smoke trailed behind the wing, when fire engulfed the engines, when the admiral who had started a war fell from the sky into the green tomb of the jungle. But while the jungle hides the bones, the story of Yamamoto's fall echoes far beyond those silent trees. It resounds across the oceans that once carried fleets to battle. It lives in the pages of military history, in the testimonies of pilots and planners, and in the minds of all who reflect on the scale and cost of the global conflict. The mission is taught in war colleges. It is studied by historians. It is whispered by old men at reunions, voices trembling not with pride, but with reverence for what it took, not just to win a battle, but to alter the course of a war. And so Operation Vengeance endures, not merely as the killing of a man, but as a moment when strategy, courage, and sacrifice converged. It is a reminder that even in war, precision matters, that brains, as much as bullets, shape the future. That sometimes victory comes not with a roar, but with the quiet transmission of a coded message, the hum of engines over the Pacific, and the resolve of men willing to give everything in the service of something greater than themselves.